I will call Ms Payne to move her notice of motion 1552.
Thank you, President, and I rise to speak on motion 1552 in my name. Nearly a century of cannabis prohibition has failed. It has failed as drug policy, it has failed to deliver better public health outcomes, and it has failed as a matter of social justice. Increasingly, the evidence is clear, and so is the growing public recognition that we need a different and better approach. That is why this motion calling on the government to support the Cannabis Legislation Plebiscite Bill 2026 is important. We are not asking anyone to pretend that cannabis is harmless. We are simply asking this Parliament to accept the evidence. What we are asking is that you trust Victorians enough to have their say. By asking Victorians a simple question: do you believe cannabis should be legalised? For decades, governments have made decisions about cannabis policy without giving Victorians a say. We all know that cannabis is already part of Australian society. People use it, people access medicinal cannabis, people grow it, people talk openly about cannabis. What prohibition has not done is eliminate cannabis. Instead, prohibition has created an enormous criminal justice footprint around the conduct that, for many people, poses a far lower risk to the community than any other legal substance. It has consumed police resources in a time where Victoria needs our police to be focused on organised and serious crime. It has brought everyday Victorians into contact with the criminal justice system. Creating criminal records and consequences that follow people for years, affecting employment, housing, travel and education for almost 4,000 Victorians who get arrested for the possession of cannabis every year. And of course, the evidence is clear that the burden of those consequences has not fallen equally. We know that First Nations Victorians are disproportionately affected by cannabis enforcement and are around 11 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. First Nations peoples continue to be incarcerated for small cannabis possessions. We heard from the Premier himself recently that he is open to discussing the removal of criminal penalties, as these penalties have been shown to disproportionately impact First Nations people. If we are serious about treaty, we must also be serious about addressing the laws and systems that continue to produce these unequal outcomes. I have been here in this Parliament for almost 4 years now, and throughout that time I have continued to raise the voices of people who have been impacted by discrimination, systemic barriers, and the failures of cannabis prohibition. I have sat with people whose lives have been turned upside down by a cannabis charge. People who have lost employment opportunities, had their driver's licence taken away, faced stigma, been denied access to housing, or been forced to navigate a criminal justice system simply because they use a substance that millions of Australians use. We have come a long way in the 4 years. The conversation has changed. The evidence has changed. Community attitudes have changed. Even the government's own public position has shifted to one that acknowledges that we should be focused on our health rather than a criminal justice response. In 2020, there was an inquiry into the use of cannabis in Victoria, and its final report was tabled in August 2021. The inquiry made a significant recommendation that the Victorian government should investigate legalising cannabis for adult personal use. The government did not support the recommendations of the inquiry, but indicated it was open to further discussion about cannabis reform. In 2023, I introduced the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Amendment Regulation of Personal Adult Use of Cannabis Bill 2023. The bill was about establishing a sensible and regulated framework for adult personal use of cannabis, to allow for adults to possess small quantities of cannabis for personal use, to grow up to 6 plants of cannabis plants per residence, and allow adults to consume cannabis in private settings. It was an effort to adopt a similar approach to the ACT. This led to an inquiry to consider the end report on the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Amendment Regulation of Personal Adult Use of Cannabis Bill 2023, including consideration of the impacts and outcomes of the Australian Capital Territory's approach to decriminalising the personal use of cannabis. After 2 parliamentary inquiries into the legalisation of personal cannabis use, the Victorian government still refuses to seriously consider the evidence, expertise and experience placed before it. Stakeholders across the legal, health, drug and alcohol, justice and harm reduction sectors have repeatedly told this Parliament that prohibition is failing. We have heard from experts about the harms caused by criminalisation, from people directly impacted by the current laws, and from organisations with decades of experience working on the front line. We have also seen what is happening beyond Victoria. The ACT has taken a different approach to personal cannabis use, while jurisdictions overseas have moved towards regulated legalisation, providing valuable evidence about what reform can look like in practice. And then there is the Victorian community itself. Public opinion on cannabis has shifted considerably. Australians increasingly recognise that possessing a small amount of cannabis for personal use should not result in a criminal record or bring someone into contact with the criminal justice system. Yet despite 2 inquiries, expert evidence, international and interstate experience and growing public support, the government continues to drag its feet. Progress for reform has been painfully slow, and while governments deliberate, people continue to experience the consequences of prohibition. The purpose of this bill is more fundamental than legalising cannabis. It allows people who live under these laws to have a direct say about whether these laws should continue. And this is not about telling Victorians what the answer should be, it's about trusting them to make the decision. If we genuinely believe in democracy, we should trust Victorians with this question. The Herald Sun asked the question on behalf of the Carroll government, and no surprise, 84% of Victorians said yes, recreational cannabis should be legalised. Once again, public opinion has delivered a resounding message in support of this. If we genuinely believe in evidence-based policy, we should be prepared to put the evidence before the public. And if we genuinely believe that cannabis prohibition has reached a point where reform is worthy of serious consideration, then surely we should let Victorians have their say. For almost a century, cannabis prohibition has been imposed from above. This bill offers something different. It is about giving Victorians a voice. It says, after decades of prohibition, after years of evidence, after countless lives affected, let people decide what comes next. That, to me, is democracy at its best. There is something particularly important about doing that through a plebiscite. Cannabis policy has been debated in this Parliament for decades, and governments have commissioned reports, experts have presented evidence, courts have dealt with the consequences of prohibition. Health professionals, legal experts, researchers and community organisations have repeatedly called for reform, and public attitudes have changed dramatically. A plebiscite would not diminish the role of this Parliament, quite the opposite. It would give Parliament a clear democratic mandate to consider the next steps. If Victorians vote against legalisation, then that is the outcome that we must respect. But if Victorians vote in favour, this Parliament would have a clear responsibility to develop a framework that is evidence-based, tightly regulated and focused on reducing harm. That is democracy. And surely, on an issue as consequential and as long-standing as cannabis prohibition, Victorians deserve the opportunity to have their say. Next year marks the 100th year anniversary of prohibition of cannabis in Victoria. Every year we continue prohibition, we continue to waste public resources policing personal cannabis possession. We continue to expose people to criminal penalties. We prop up an illegal market. We continue to see disproportionate impacts on already marginalised communities. And we continue to operate a system that, after nearly a century, has not achieved its stated objective of eliminating cannabis use. The question is no longer whether cannabis exists. It does. The question is whether our laws are making the situation better or worse. I believe the evidence increasingly tells us that prohibition is not working. And I believe Victorians are ready for a mature conversation about what will come next. This is not about being soft on drugs. It is about recognising that criminalisation is not the only tool available to government. It is about treating drug use as a public health and social policy issue where appropriate, rather than defaulting to criminal justice. And it is about recognising that good policy should be judged by the outcomes it produces and not simply by how long we have had it. After almost a century, we should have the courage to ask whether prohibition has delivered what it promised. The evidence is very clear that it has not. The community is increasingly telling us it is time for change. Experts are telling us that it is time for change. And people who have experienced the consequences of prohibition are telling us that it is time for change. So let us give Victorians the opportunity to decide. Let us put the question directly to the people. Do we continue a century of prohibition, or do we move towards a legal, regulated and evidence-based cannabis framework? Thank you.
Ms Terpstra.
Thank you, Acting President. I rise to make a contribution on this motion, and I thank Ms Payne for bringing this important motion to the House. And it is, as we are all aware, on cannabis reform, but at the central part of this motion is about a plebiscite as well. So it will obviously come as a disappointment. The government's position on this is that the government opposes this motion, but nevertheless we do have something to say about this motion. And I just recently met with a group in regard to legal and illicit drug taking in Victoria, and I'm always interested to hear the sorts of things that Victorians might consume. And it's always disappointing to hear, sadly, that alcohol is still one of those things that is more highly consumed than illicit drugs. And illicit drug taking, again, is a problem, of course, but alcohol still presents the most level of harm for Victorians. And so we have a very proud record in terms of supporting the sector and a health-led approach to reducing alcohol and drug-related harm. And we've made a significant investment to expand drug treatment, supports and harm minimisation services for those who need it. I'm also very fortunate to have Turning Point in my electorate. That Turning Point is a inpatient facility that's based at Box Hill, and they do amazing work helping Victorians who want to become clean, get clean with the support that they need, both first of all in an inpatient hospital facility and then at a house where they can stay and learn about behaviours and triggers and those sorts of things and how to manage their addictions and their behaviours. So, and again, that just goes and speaks to the investment that our government is making in terms of helping people who want to, I guess, try and turn their lives around in terms of not taking illicit drugs and alcohol. But since 2014, our government has invested more than $3 billion in drug and alcohol treatment support and harm minimisation initiatives, sitting alongside substantial legislative reform achievements, and there's $415.5 million allocated in the 2026-27 state budget, which will allow us to continue and expand life-saving and life-changing services and initiatives. But as I just said, we know that alcohol and other drug harms are increasing, and each year more than 40,000 people access alcohol and drug treatment and harm reduction supports. And one of the questions I asked the group that I met with, VADA, the other day about was what we are also hearing is, whilst there's a lot of focus on alcohol and illicit drugs, also there is an increasing amount of people who are taking aesthetic type drugs or peptides, injectables, and we're seeing a growing demand on needle exchange programs. So again, people who are wanting to, I guess, shred, look great in the gym and all those sorts of things, we're seeing peptides and those sorts of drug taking is increasing as well. And as I said, that's putting demand on our needle exchange programs. But as I said, also I know that we do know that there are groups within our community that are at an increased risk of alcohol and drug-related harm, and our services need to be flexible and tailored to meet people where they're at. Now, in terms of the plebiscite, this was interesting. I know myself and Ms Watt, we're both on the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, and this private member's bill was the subject of a SARC meeting this week, and the issue is in regard to the bill that, and I'll bring this to the Chamber's attention, that the SARC report, which I tabled in this chamber on Tuesday, includes the analysis of the LCV's bill, which is the basis for the motion before the House today. And the report highlights one concerning element of the bill, which is, according to Clause 7 of the bill, it appears, whether it's inadvertently or not, or perhaps purposely, I'm not sure, but it would make it an offence for a person not to vote or participate in this plebiscite. So Victorians could be slugged with a $210 fine for not voting in what is a non-binding plebiscite. And so normally these sorts of things are really reserved for electoral processes, like we go and vote in a state election. And of course the electoral provisions of the Electoral Act apply to that. But it would be, yes, quite interesting where you're asking people to participate in a non-binding plebiscite. Exactly what it is. So the question is really, is it on purpose or by accident? I'm not sure, but either way, really an irrelevant question. Either way, if you were not to participate in this plebiscite, you would be fined $210. So I'm not sure that that is a particularly well thought out strategy, because if you're basically saying to someone, I'm forcing you to give me your opinion about this, you're probably going to get a negative answer with the threat of a fine hanging over your head. So in a cost of living crisis, every dollar counts, and the SARC report shows that perhaps, as I said, this has not been properly thought through. So that's quite disappointing that you know, rather than trying to build social licence around participation in plebiscite by encouraging people through education and the like, and bringing people on a journey with you about this, the threat of a fine is what the blunt instrument that has been chosen by Legalise Cannabis to force people to vote in a plebiscite if this bill was successful. Acting President, I might say that Victoria was the first jurisdiction in the country to legalise the use of medicinal cannabis in 2016 through the Access to Medicinal Cannabis Act, which paved the way for other states to do it. We've taken measured, thoughtful steps on this reform. We sought expert advice from the Victorian Law Reform Commission on how to appropriately amend the law and on key issues including cultivation, manufacture and supply of high-quality medicinal cannabis products within Victoria, patient eligibility, appropriate clinical oversight involving specialists, general practitioners, nurses and pharmacists, and the need for ongoing research and clinical trials. Also, the Commission provided over 40 recommendations to the government, including the need to establish an independent medical advisory committee on medical cannabis to provide advice about expanding eligibility for future patient groups as well. Now, any doctor or nurse practitioner in Victoria can prescribe medicinal cannabis for any patient with any condition if they believe it is clinically appropriate to do so. And of course, today, medicinal cannabis is most often prescribed for the treatment of chronic pain, but it's also used to treat anxiety, cancer-related symptoms such as pain, nausea, appetite, reduced appetite, epilepsy, insomnia, and multiple sclerosis. So again, Acting President, another example of this government listening to people and meeting them where they're at in terms of, ensuring that people have options when it comes to the treatment or management of pain. Medicinal cannabis does work for some people, there's no doubt about that. It's not effective for some people for whatever reason. People have different needs when it comes to pain, it's one treatment that's available, but again, it's something that doctors or nurse practitioners are responsible for dispensing. So I'll just quickly step back to the SARC report. I know I've got just under 2 minutes left to talk on this motion. But in terms of the SARC report, I think the bottom line was, with that open question about, the provisions of Clause 7 then falling foul of the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, because the Charter's right that it offends, the Charter's right to freedom of expression, which also may include the right to not hold or not to express an opinion on the legalisation of cannabis. So it's also a negative duty. So it's like, I have a right to not participate in this plebiscite. So that's where this offends the human rights aspect, the Human Rights Charter. And so the committee then did resolve to write to the members seeking further information about the compatibility of Clause 7 with the Charter's right to freedom of expression. So I bring that to the Chamber's attention today, notwithstanding the fact that is something that does need noting. Nevertheless, the issue around, as I've spoken to, medicinal cannabis is an important one, and our government has certainly listened, responded and acted in regard to people who were seeking that as a way of managing pain. But also, Acting President, I was just sitting here talking to my colleagues before, Ms Watt, about, again, what illicit drugs people are consuming. But, pill testing is another important example of reform that our government has taken and listened to people about. In this year's budget, we've invested $9.6 million over 2 years to support a successful pill testing trial. So again, we're quite prepared to listen, but unfortunately this motion and the plebiscite that's proposed is a little bit underdone for the reasons that I outlined. And as I said, the government's position on this motion, we will be opposing this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Terpstra. Mr Mulholland.
Thank you, Acting President. I rise to speak on Ms Payne's motion, and I thank her for bringing it to the chamber about her plebiscite to legalise cannabis. When I saw this, I was like, it's always interesting. It's like, what new way can we debate the legalisation of cannabis? And so it is creative. It's like the last shot in the locker for the Legalise Cannabis Party. And from the outset, I'd like to state that unfortunately I will not be supporting this motion. And so I apologise for that. But it's I find it interesting where we are, sort of 5 seconds to midnight. The Legalise Cannabis Victoria have finally remembered again why they're here and brought up the issue of legalising cannabis again, which is what the party, you'd think, would be on about every week. I mean, you had one job. You had one job over 4 years. And I can't help but wonder if it's somehow connected to the decision of this chamber last night to abolish group voting tickets, or whether you needed to remind the Victorian people in the lead up to the election what your party actually stands for. Because I did a little bit of analysis, and I know Mr Ettershank and Ms Payne have spoken a lot in the chamber spoken a lot in the chamber. But Mr Ettershank has only mentioned the word cannabis in about 22% of contributions. And Ms Payne did a bit better. She mentioned the word cannabis in 25% of contributions. And so I think these numbers speak for themselves. And what is evident, is the fact that this issue has not been a focus of your time in Parliament over the last 4 years. I mean, you know, you've had both Ms Payne and Mr Ettershank bring up voluntary assisted dying, buses, data centres, waste-to-energy incinerators, conflict in the Middle East, Palestine, Trump. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is the Victorian people did not vote for 2 more members of the Reason Party. We already got rid of Fiona Patten. They voted for Legalise Cannabis. I have right-wing friends who voted for Legalise Cannabis because they truly want to legalise cannabis, and they thought it was a good laugh, and decided to put a number 1 in the Legalise Cannabis ballot. And to think that people wanted you in the last 4 years to do anything other than spend your time solely on legalising cannabis, I think gives your voters a bit too much credit. They wanted you completely to focus on exactly what your name sets out to do. There might be policies on a website, but that's not what they're looking at on the ballot paper. It's not. It's not. They wanted you to focus on this. And I can guarantee you, if you, due to the makeup of this House, if you said to the government 2 years ago, even 2 years ago, that we are no longer going to vote for any piece of legislation until cannabis is legalised, I guarantee it'd be passed now, because there was numbers of pieces of critical legislation, whether it be anti-vilification laws, whether it be treaty, where they needed both of your votes, and you just voted with them anyway. I didn't see any tangible concessions that you got out that related to cannabis, which is what you were sent here for. Cannabis probably would be legalised, because unfortunately, you did not spend your time here focusing on what people sent you here to do. They sent you here with one job. And as I said, I think you're giving Victorians who voted for you a bit too much credit to thinking that you should have been focused on VAD, bus routes, data centres, waste to energy 1,000 times, conflicts in the Middle East, Palestine, Trump. I know, you know, it goes a long way back. Like you came in here with some sort of mandate. One of the first questions Mr Ettershank asked in March of 2023 was a question on whether the Welcome to Country should go before the Lord's Prayer. That's not what people were thinking about when they voted for the Legalise Cannabis Party. And so I say to you, if you had just focused on what people sent you here for, you might have gotten somewhere. What I would say on plebiscites is that they are a valid means of testing support for a policy amongst the broader population and on issues of social policy of conscience, like, for example, the marriage equality postal survey initiated by the Turnbull Liberal government, that help demonstrate a strong social licence for change. However, it's not a means by which serious matters of government policy should be decided. The motion asks the House to hand over serious questions of health and criminal law to a popularity contest. That is the wrong way to make policy. Cannabis law reform, like other areas of drug policy, criminal justice, public health, needs to be addressed on evidence, health outcomes, policing data, treatment capacity, and the experience of other jurisdictions who have actually changed their laws. A plebiscite would not resolve the practical outcomes questions that the reform raises. It would simply outsource a decision that does belong to this parliament, elected to weigh evidence and take the responsibility for the law that passes. If the Legalise Cannabis Party really believes cannabis law reform is justified, they should bring back their bill to the House. We were elected, some of us, to lead and to provide a serious answer to the questions that matter and to fix the mess that Labor have left us, not to defer to opinion polls when the going gets tough. I think as I mentioned, I think if they legalise cannabis, I honestly think, if I was a voter for Legalise Cannabis Victoria, I would be a bit disappointed about the issues that the members here, elected members, have represented here in this place. I mean, to only actually focus on it for a very less than half, or about a quarter of the time that you're here, and focus on all these other trendy issues. They might have been reason party issues, but Legalise Cannabis Victoria, when you see that on a ballot paper, people, the voters of Victoria, expect you to focus on that one thing, and just that one thing. Unfortunately, that has not happened with this political party. And I think if they had actually had a dogged determination to just focus on that thing, I reckon cannabis would be legalised here in Victoria. It would. It would. If they had have said no, you look at the makeup of the parliament, you can almost guarantee it would have happened. But no, they decided to be part of the progressive crossbench so that they get secret, special preference and treatment by the government to do advanced deals before these bills get to the chamber. And of course, they never, in return for support for any of those bills, got the one thing they were sent here to do, which is legalising cannabis. Never once got that passed into legislation, which, I think would be disappointing to their voters. And so they'll go out again at this state election coming up and say, vote for Legalise Cannabis Victoria because this is what we're going to do, not vote for Legalise Cannabis Victoria because we'll spend a quarter of the time on it and focus on all these other trendy issues. Because that's ultimately what they've done over the last 4 years and what they will probably do over the next 4 years should they be re-elected. I'll go back to the motion. As I said, I won't be supporting this motion. I don't think a plebiscite is worth our time, and I'm also quite concerned with what Ms Terpstra said, that you would be seeking to fine people that don't participate in this plebiscite as well. Thank you.
Mr Limerick.
Thank you, Acting President. My views, Libertarian Party's views on cannabis legalisation are well known. In fact, I spoke about it in my inaugural speech. I've been a long-time supporter of legalising cannabis for recreational, industrial and medical use in Victoria. So that said, I will be supporting this motion, but I do have some concerns. I don't like plebiscites. I see plebiscites as a way of, in this case, voting on people's rights. I don't think that people's rights should be voted on. I didn't like the marriage equality plebiscite. I don't think that people's rights should be voted on. However, if it is a way that would be non-binding, as I understand this would be for the parliament, if it is a way of demonstrating to whoever is the government of the day the popularity of this issue, then I think that's a good thing. I also note, look, some of the framing of this motion I quite strongly object to, actually, when we talk about people's rights and the legalisation of cannabis somehow is related to race issues around, First Nations people and somehow related to treaty. I don't think it's got anything to do with that. In fact, I think Victorians are sick of talking about identity politics and race-based politics, and maybe I think government's actually woken up to that and is actually taking notice of that, as I hope the opposition is also. People are sick of this identity politics. They're sick to death of it. And frankly, it's, why not have all different races in here and make commentary about all different races? Well, we wouldn't do that because it's racist, and I don't see the point of doing that. We should be just talking about the rights of all Victorians, because under the principle of equality under law, the rights of all Victorians should be equal. That is, in fact, why I opposed the treaty. The main reason, there was a bunch of other reasons, but the main reason is because I believed in the principle of equality under law, and judging whether or not we should legalise something based on whether one particular racial group is more or less affected by it breaches that principle entirely. So I think that that is a bad thing. And I think that the people that you need to convince of, if we're actually going to get cannabis legalisation happen in Victoria, the people that you need to appeal to are not the people that care about treaty and not the people that care about disproportionate effects on minority groups. They're the people like Mr Mulholland's friend, who was a right-wing person who voted for legalised cannabis because they wanted cannabis legalised. Actually, it's the Conservative side of politics that you need to convince, because once you convince a large number of those people, then everyone else will just flip. I mean, we've already convinced most of the left side of politics. The reason the Labor Party doesn't support legalisation of cannabis is because they're scared of the reaction of the Conservative side of politics. But I actually think that there's a lot of people on the Conservative side of politics who like cannabis legalisation. In fact, many of them may be cannabis consumers themselves, and they wouldn't really object to it if it was done in a way that respected people's rights and wasn't done in a way that would not undermine organised crime. I've said many times I am not a fan of the decriminalisation model that has been spoken about many times here. I'm not a fan of that. The main reason I'm not a fan of that is because it does absolutely nothing to address the biggest problem in Victoria at the moment, which is organised crime. Decriminalisation won't address that, but a legal, regulated market will do that. And the fact of the matter is there was, and there always will be, a cannabis market in Victoria. The question that this Parliament and Victorians need to grapple with is, are we going to have that market run by organised crime, or is it going to be a legal, regulated market? And I think that most sensible people on the Conservative side of politics would hopefully come to the realisation that they would rather have a legal, regulated market than have organised crime running it. It's over $1 billion industry in Victoria alone for organised crime. We've seen how much damage they've done to this state, these criminal groups. And if we can use the power of economics to undermine them, and if Conservatives don't like cannabis or whatever, maybe they can hold their nose because of the benefits that we'll see through undermining these criminal networks. And I think even many in the Liberal Party would probably agree with me on that. And we need to get popular support for that. It hasn't got there yet. This Parliament hasn't done it. I actually agree with Mr Mulholland. There's probably a few points during this Parliament where we probably, Legalise Cannabis or others in the progressive crossbench could have actually said, well, we're not going to do this unless you legalise cannabis. And it didn't happen, unfortunately, because I would have been passionately supportive of that, because it's been something that I've cared about for a long time. But it hasn't happened. If a plebiscite is a method of giving Parliament confidence that it does have popular social licence, then I will support it. I do share Ms Terpstra's and Mr Mulholland's concerns about plebiscites being compulsory, but unfortunately all voting is compulsory in Australia. I don't support compulsory voting either. I think that people should be able to decide if they want to vote or not. As it is, people, if they don't want to vote, they just go along and draw a dirty picture on the ballot or whatever they do, but I don't think it should be compulsory. But if people want to express an opinion through a plebiscite, I don't see a problem with that. But it needs to be framed in a way that respects the principles of equality under law and will appeal to a wide range of Victorians, not just those who care about identity politics.
Ms Watt.
Acting President, thank you very much for the call and the opportunity to make a contribution, and thank you, Ms Payne, for moving aside such that I can speak on this motion today. I just want to start and say that this is a complex and sensitive area of alcohol and drug policy, and our government proudly and consistently takes a harm minimisation approach. We know that these issues require a nuanced, mature and a health-led conversation. far too long, public discussions around drug reform across the country have been bogged down in stigma that does nothing to support vulnerable Victorians. We're a government that looks towards evidence-based policies that tangibly improve health and social outcomes. Our record over the last decade, well, it speaks for itself. We listen to health experts, to vulnerable community members, and get on with delivering meaningful life-saving reform. These are complex policy matters that come with potential benefits but also potential risks. Risks which our government clearly does not take lightly. We will continue working to reduce the harms associated with drug use through coordinated, evidence-based health action across the state. As outlined in responses previously, our government will continue to explore meaningful ways to reduce harm, support individuals and keep Victorians safe. This includes our government supporting diversion programs as an effective way for minor drug offenders to avoid a lifelong criminal record. These crucial programs encourage individuals to participate in alternative actions that actively promote rehabilitation, delivering vastly improved, lasting outcomes for both the person and their community. I might just take a moment now to go to the main call in this motion, which is a call for a plebiscite on cannabis legalisation. Our government's position is grounded in a sense of responsibility regarding how we focus government attention and public resources. We genuinely respect the intent behind wanting to gauge community sentiment on this issue, as hearing from Victorians is vital. However, we believe that our primary focus should be on funding frontline health, treatment and support services. Every single dollar our government should spend should be directed where it delivers the absolute greatest and most immediate impact and benefit for the Victorian community. Victorians will have the opportunity to vote on a vast range of policies, government priorities and comprehensive platforms at the ballot box this coming November. It's important to highlight that when it comes to the policy area of medicinal cannabis, our government has proudly led the nation, and Victoria was the very first jurisdiction in the country to legalise the use of medicinal cannabis back in 2016 through the Access to Medicinal Cannabis Act. This was a landmark reform that brought much needed relief to so many families and paved the way for other states and territories to introduce their own legislation. You see, we took measured, thoughtful and regulated steps, ensuring from day one that these changes were designed solely for the benefit of Victorians suffering from severe and chronic conditions. And ahead of the 2014 election, we outlined that a Labor government would modernise Victorian laws so those in need could safely access the therapeutic benefits of cannabis. We knew that families were facing impossible situations, trying to support sick loved ones, often forced to choose between breaking the law or watching a family member suffer. And we acted to change the law responsibly. To ensure the reforms were robust and grounded in rigorous clinical evidence, we sought expert advice from the Victorian Law Reform Commission. We carefully examined key issues including the local cultivation, manufacture and supply of high-quality medicinal cannabis products to build a safe, reliable and local industry. We examined patient eligibility, clinical oversight involving general practitioners, specialists, nurses and pharmacists, and embedded ongoing research and clinical trials directly into the framework. The Commission provided over 40 comprehensive recommendations, including establishing an independent medical advisory committee to guide eligibility expansion over time. Today, because of those necessary pioneering reforms, any doctor or nurse practitioner in Victoria can prescribe medicinal cannabis for any patient with any condition, provided that they deem it clinically appropriate. It's now widely prescribed for chronic pain while transforming lives by managing severe anxiety, cancer-related symptoms, epilepsy, insomnia and multiple sclerosis. We transformed the medical landscape in this state by putting health outcomes and patient care first. and our commitment to health-led harm reduction extends across the entire alcohol and drug sector. Our government is proud to support a health-led approach to reduce drug-related harm right across Victoria, and in that we have made investments to expand treatment networks and harm minimisation services, because we know that providing care rather than stigma is what truly protects lives. And since 2014, our government has invested more than $3 billion in drug and alcohol treatment, support and harm reduction initiatives, backed by a further $415.5 million allocated in the 2026-2027 budget. And this funding enables us to expand life-changing services statewide, acknowledging that more than 40,000 people access treatment and support each year. We know that different groups across our state face varying risks, which is why our services must remain flexible, accessible and tailored to meet people where they're at in their lives. The establishment of the state's first medically supervised injecting service in my electorate in North Richmond is a clear example of our commitment to evidence-based drug policy that works. It's fundamentally about saving lives, reducing community harm and connecting people with genuine pathways out of addiction. That centre there in North Richmond has safely managed more than 13,000 overdoses while relieving pressure on local emergency departments and ambulance services. Crucially, the service provides clients with holistic, non-judgmental health and social supports, connecting vulnerable housing to people, and of course there's mental health support, rehabilitation services also available to help stabilise lives. Similarly, I was just actually reflecting yesterday that our Victorian pill testing service represents another nation-leading health-focused reform that prioritises safety. That is supported by a $9.2 million investment over 2 years, including in this budget, and builds on successful trials. And between August 25 and June 26, the fixed site tested over 4,600 samples and conducted more than 2,300 harm reduction conversations. And for over 39% of service users, this was their very first time having a conversation with a healthcare professional about their substance use. The mobile service tested a further 2,400 samples at festivals, conducted over 1,500 health consultations with around 12% of samples containing unexpected or harmful substances, including dangerous synthetic opioids, and this service provides essential real-time health data and warnings that prevent harm and save young lives. Addressing drug harm requires a comprehensive statewide approach, and that's why our $95 million statewide action plan expands access to public pharmacotherapy with $8.4 million, and alongside $4.4 million to deploy the 24/7 naloxone dispensing machines in high-risk areas. We are expanding outreach teams in St Kilda and Footscray and supporting critical community facilities in the CBD of Melbourne. And this includes the Salvation Army's Health Clinic on Burke Street, led by Major Brendan Noddle. There is, of course, funding for an additional community health service in the CBD. That's 36.4 that's gone towards that. You see, this hub there in the city will provide wraparound health, mental health and social support, and deliver the Victorian first trial of hydromorphone therapy. And this is for individuals with really complex opioid dependence, where traditional treatments have proven ineffective, ensuring that even the most vulnerable individuals receive specialised clinical support. Acting President, our government's focus remains guided by evidence, compassion and continued investment in frontline health services that indeed save lives. We'll continue to deliver practical health-led solutions that protect Victorians and support families across our state. And can I thank you for the opportunity to make a contribution, and thank the mover of this motion for bringing it to the House for debate this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Watt. Ms Crozier.
Thank you very much, Acting President. I rise to speak to Ms Payne's motion, and I'm slightly deviating from Mr Mulholland. I think you've raised your issues on a number of occasions in the Parliament over the last 3.5 years, because I have heard you speak on a number of things, especially around medicinal cannabis, and that's probably where we differ, because I do support medicinal cannabis because you can regulate it, and it has gone through testing and approval, and has rigorous testing around that and safeguards. And I was going back to have a look at your motion and the request for a plebiscite on the legalisation of cannabis, and went back to look at the inquiry that I was a part of when Ms Patton was here. She drove this issue before you came into the parliament. She should have been the Cannabis Party, really, because she was on this case for years, and we did have this inquiry, and we wrote a minority report. We didn't fully support what the chair or a number of recommendations were in the report, because we did have concerns about certain aspects that came before us. And it was a very good inquiry. It was a very thorough inquiry, and we heard from a lot of excellent submitters and the submissions that we received and those hearings that we held from witnesses. And there were concerns that I still have around the impacts of cannabis, and I'll come to that. But I just want to go back to this point about the plebiscite on cannabis legalisation. And you speak about, as Mr Limbrick said, actually, it was you calling out certain subgroups of the community and talking about treaty. Well, if you're looking at a plebiscite and treaty, Australia held a referendum, a basic plebiscite on the voice, and voted no. So we've had that plebiscite and that referendum. I don't know why it's singled out in this, and certainly there was evidence in our inquiry that we understood there was various individuals and others actually that were vulnerable and were at risk of ending up in the criminal justice system. And one of the areas in our minority report that we spoke of was concerns around the evidence that was provided by Assistant Commissioner Glenn Weir, very, very well regarded within Victoria Police, and the concerns that Victoria Police had around safety and driving impacts, looking at the issues around education. We made some very strong recommendations around education in schools and the harms of drugs, and this government has dropped the ball. They've legalised pill testing and they haven't done any of the drug education that really should be done. One of the concerns I have is around the harms of cannabis that it came out very clearly through various submitters. I still have those concerns, and I'm very concerned about the potency of dope now, the potency of cannabis now. It's a very different drug from the 70s and when you were a young man, Mr. Ettershank, and when it was, it is, but in all seriousness, I'm concerned about the genetically modified cannabis and the potency of cannabis. I'm worried about just the issue of that you've raised in your private members bill of having a few plants growing in the backyard, and who regulates that, who polices that, how is that monitored? It can't. And then we do have, it won't drive out a black market. It'll, I believe, further a black market. We're having problems with illegal tobacco now, and alcohol and cannabis are very different in terms of the components of illegal cannabis versus illegal alcohol. Two very different things. It's a very different argument. Very much harder to have illegal alcohol rather than illegal cannabis. So I have got these concerns, and I'll go back to the issue around the harms caused by cannabis. And there needs to be more work done on this, because too many people within the medical profession will tell you that constant use for many, many people have significant harms, psychosis, and it's awful. They're very concerned around the mental health impacts and the psychosis that develops due to cannabis use. Now, a bit like smoking, not everyone gets lung cancer if they smoke. Not everyone's going to get severe psychosis with cannabis, but there is a range of medicos who say we just are concerned around the increasing potency, the increasing numbers of psychosis, drug use, this cocktail of drugs that is out there, putting it all together, it is causing a very, very dangerous situation and a very real concerns. And we see that on our roads with the number of car accidents. We can't test for cocaine in this state. Drug testing has dropped off under this government. We've got real concerns around those issues. So I just want to say again around what the AMA have said, and I'll take that from this report, where they say where they highlighted the short and long term of health impacts. People can experience immediate impacts to mental health, such as reduced brain function, anxiety or panic attacks, paranoia or memory loss. Cannabis users are more likely to develop psychosis or schizophrenia. Physical impacts can include impaired reaction time, balance and information processing. Cannabis can be addictive and cause withdrawal symptoms. Long-term use can impair brain function, damage the person's throat and lungs and cause bronchitis or cancer, cause cardiovascular system damage and mental health conditions such as depression. Using cannabis while pregnant is associated with lower birth weight of babies. Using cannabis is associated with alcohol, tobacco and other drug use. And I'd say that cocktail of drugs is a very real concern. One of the other witnesses said there are known issues with cardiovascular problems of the heart and pulmonary effects of the lungs, and also issues regarding acute use, chronic use and neuropsychiatric or mental disorders as well. There have been increasing reports of overdose and toxicity by minors and increasing use. So I do think we have to caution this. I do think, some will say, look, let's just have a plebiscite, let's get over this. It's been, as the motion says, we've nearly 100 years of prohibition. Well, I say good, keep it going, because there's too many unknowns with... what? Mr Ettershank, pick me up in your contribution, I'm sure, but I am concerned about legalising this drug without the proper safeguards around it. I don't support it. I think there is we've got enough problems with enough illegal drugs out there, and I don't think legalising cannabis is going to improve the situation at all. I just don't think it is, and I think there are issues around most of the people where there are problems within our courts. There is multiple drug use, or there are other issues related with many of these things. We need to be doing more. We need to be doing more to support people to get off drugs. We need more education around the harmful impacts of drug use, of mixing drugs, whether that's alcohol, whether that's other drugs. With cannabis, I'm completely, and I think we're all in agreement with that point. I know this is an area that you, Ms Payne and Mr Ettershank, have been pushing. I respect that. That's why we're having the debate. But respectfully, I do not agree with your motion today.
Mr Ettershank.
Thank you, Acting President. I rise to speak on my colleague Ms Payne's motion calling on the government to allow Victorians a say on whether they support the legalisation of cannabis in Victoria. I can only echo Ms Payne's comments that cannabis prohibition is a failed policy. Since the passing of the Poisons Act in 1928, we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars policing cannabis use to absolutely no avail. In fact, cannabis use has continued to grow over the decades. It is by far and away the most widely consumed illicit substance in Australia. Prohibition and criminalisation has done little more than waste our valuable justice resources and created criminal empires. Attitudes have changed. At least 21% of Victorians regularly use cannabis, and 80% of Victorians agree that it should no longer be a criminal offence. 80% of Victorians agree that it is well and truly time to end the prohibition and the criminalisation of cannabis. And I believe our Premier also agrees, because he knows the impact that criminalisation has, particularly on our young people, on working class people, on our First Nations people, on Pacifica people, on African Australian people, on lower income Victorians. He knows that our police force can be more effectively deployed tackling real crime, the sort of serious crime that is affecting our communities. If they're not wasting their time and resources busting people for possessing or cultivating small amounts of cannabis for personal use, there is no shortage of things for our police to focus on. And he would not be the first Premier to come to this conclusion. Former Premier Jeff Kennett at last year's Pennington oration stated that his failure to reform our cannabis laws in 1996 was one of the major regrets of his time as Premier. And unfortunately he's not here with us today, but Mr Davis made a wonderful contribution. 30 years ago, he was still light years ahead of where Mr Mulholland can only hope to reach. Victorians are ready for change. The real question is why other members in this place are not. Why they persist in these same tired, discredited arguments. The reason we hear so many anecdotes of problematic cannabis use from opponents of decriminalisation, when the vast majority of people who consume cannabis are law-abiding, tax-paying, decent people, is because they're not going to admit it. Why should they, when it's a criminal offence and so shrouded in harmful stigma? We have never said that cannabis is a harmless drug. People have shared stories of friends or acquaintances who have issues with cannabis, whose problematic cannabis use has contributed to physical or mental health issues. And in those cases, people should have access to support. That is the heart of a health-led recovery, and one which this government has turned its back on. The last thing they need is to be arrested, charged, and end up with a criminal record. We know beyond any shadow of a doubt that any contact with the criminal justice system leads to further harms. It can lead to loss of employment and housing and to further contact with the justice system. So many lives ruined. And for what? We're talking about a victimless crime. I want to pick up a couple of comments that people have made. Firstly, thanking Ms Terpstra for her usual thoughtful contribution. On the question of the mandatory or the compulsory plebiscite, I must say we took advice from OCPC on that. I'm sure if it was such a big issue, we would have been more than happy to apply for, to look to amendment, but never mind. To suggest from Ms Terpstra that the plebiscite somehow, we need to bring people on a journey. Bring people on a journey. Somewhere between 80 and 87% of people support this policy. And in terms of journeys, maybe Ms Terpstra could catch up with the journey that's been taken by the ALP State Conference, who for the last 3 years have argued for this, and yet you just pretend it's not there. I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, Mr Mulholland, my friend, seriously, getting career counselling from you, Mr Mulholland, is about as welcome as an ice water enema. We have used every option, you say, but then we've not talked about it enough. Well, make up your mind, son, make up your mind. I think it's that schizophrenic quality in so many of your policies that might be eroding your voter base. And I also compliment you that I think, apart from your last sentence, across your 10-minute contribution, you didn't actually mention anything to do with what this motion's about. So I think that's a first. I've never seen quite that level of irrelevance in a debate. Mr Limbrick says that Conservatives need to be persuaded. Well, I think they've been persuaded, The reality is, I think that if, and let's face it, this is the elephant in the room here, yeah? If somewhere between 80 and 87% of the people support decriminalisation, Yep, they want it decriminalised. That leaves somewhere between 13 and 20% who don't know or don't support it. I guess that's about the same, really. Well, it's actually, yeah, it's about the same as your primary vote at the moment, really, isn't it, for the Liberal Party? What wouldn't you give? What wouldn't you give to actually come to the Victorian people, or for the Labor Party for that matter, to actually put up something that has 80% public support? And the elephant in the room here is that nobody's talking about the fact that there is an overwhelming consensus within this community for this change. The arrogance is so utterly staggering. You shared your contempt for democracy last night in scuttling proportional representation, and you have just reinforced the isolation, the contempt that is held for so many politicians today. It doesn't matter what the overwhelming majority of people want, it's what you think's good. Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Mulholland, don't hold your breath if that's your secret to success in politics. Now, I would like to thank Ms. Crozier, who I think is possibly the only contribution to date, apart from Ms. Payne's, that's actually addressed the motion. And I respect her views, we don't agree, but at least she's happy to put them forward and to speak honestly and openly in a public debate, as opposed to half-assed career counselling. President, the bottom line here is that as jurisdictions around the world face up to the failure of cannabis prohibition to deter use and its extraordinary cost and legalised cannabis uses, they change. They change. I think it was Menzies who said, "Why do I change my mind?" When circumstances change. You know, maybe you should think about that, Mr. Mulholland, you know. You don't want, I mean, you can get your name carved on the desk there, but seriously. President, it is time for us to trust Victorians with the question, do you support the legalisation of cannabis? It's very simple, it's very obvious, and those who oppose it, I would suggest, have an ulterior motive. I'm not sure if this is parliamentary, President, but if you are not willing to demonstrate the courage for change, if you are not willing to demonstrate a commitment to democracy, if you're not going to get off the pot. Let Victorians decide how they wish to see this issue treated, because we're all going to be old and dead by the time you folks come to some sort of a consensus. Let's let Victorians decide.
Ms Batchelor.
Thank you, President. Pleased to rise to speak on Ms Payne's motion relating to cannabis use and calling on the government to ask Victorians if they support cannabis in Victoria. Legalisation of cannabis in Victoria is proposed by the Drugs, Poisons, Controlled Substances Amendment Regulation of Personal Use of Cannabis Bill 2023. Obviously, Ms Payne and Mr Ettershank have been tireless advocates for their clear position that cannabis, the personal use of cannabis here in Victoria should be decriminalised. And that was certainly the core of the bill that they proposed 2023, was it? Yeah, a couple of years ago, which essentially sought to adopt a model similar to that which exists now in the ACT and propose that be adopted here in Victoria. I won't go through the details of what that proposal was, because there has been debate on those matters in the past, and as a consequence of a referral this chamber made, the matter and that bill was examined by the Legal and Social Issues Committee, and I was part of that inquiry, and we tabled a report into the provisions of that bill a couple of years ago, following some quite interesting debates and evidence we received both here in Melbourne but also on a trip to the ACT to hear from those including the AFP, the Capital Policing Unit in the AFP, and also drug and alcohol support in the ACT and the ACT, members of the ACT Legislative Assembly. I think it's fair to say that the government, in its response to that parliamentary committee report, made it clear that it didn't support the recommendations in that committee report to consider the issues raised in the bill. There are some concerns about that. I think one of the further issues personally that I have with the motion here today is this notion that the way we resolve this question is to put it to the people through a non-binding plebiscite. And there have been other speakers in the course of this debate that have sought to sort of posit arguments for and against the use of a plebiscite as a means of indicating public support for a matter. I, for one, am not a big believer in the use of indicative plebiscites to determine or suggest determinative positions of the Victorian people on matters of public policy. Fundamentally, I believe that this Parliament exists in a framework of representative democracy for Victoria, and it is incumbent upon us as members of this Parliament to be the ones who, duly elected by the Victorian people at free and fair elections every 4 years, get to make laws for the state. I don't think that putting standalone questions to the people on indicative policy issues is the way that our democracy has and should operate. I'm a believer in parliamentary democracy. I'm a believer in the way and the will of the Parliament to achieve those changes. I think there are many ways in which policy change gets enacted, and sometimes it is a tireless grind. And we've certainly seen, and I'm not using this in the pejorative, but we've seen relentless advocacy, I think, from our colleagues on the crossbench from Legalise Cannabis and others, supporting their position on the decriminalisation of adult use of cannabis here in the state of Victoria. I think to achieve the outcome that they are seeking, the elected representatives in this place have got to continue that relentless grind, and that it's not a solvable issue by way of an indicative plebiscite, survey, whatever, poll that effectively a plebiscite delivers. I think that in our constitutional context, taking questions to the people on matters should be restricted to matters associated with the constitutional framework that exists. And certainly we're having a debate in the Parliament yesterday about a matter which one of the further steps that some advocated could only be determined via a referendum. So I think those are the appropriate circumstances in which matters should be taken to the people directly. I think that matters of policy are ones that the Parliament needs to do its job on. And at this time, there is not support in the Parliament for the provisions of the bill that Ms Payne's motion seeks to advocate. What we have from the government is a couple of, I think, really important indications of an approach that is focused on harm minimisation and health and therapeutic benefit. You see across the board from this Labor government over the past more than a decade in office that harm minimisation has been an incredibly important part of our approach to drug law reform in this state. Things like the medically supervised injecting facility, things like the drug checking, permanent drug checking service, the pill testing service, the fixed site and the mobile sites, the additional focus on the rollout of pharmacotherapy, the way that for the, in a nation leading first, we've got the rollout of things like the naloxone vending machines, a consistent approach to support harm minimisation and support those who do use drugs, because they do exist in our community. People do take illicit substances in our community, and this government has very clearly adopted a harm minimisation approach to make sure that those who are using illicit substances are doing so in a way that is both fully informed about the consequences and supported within a medical framework for those who need it. And I don't think that you can, in any way, shape or form, suggest that this government isn't serious about the harm minimisation approach that it takes to illicit substances and drugs in our community. The second is the very clear therapeutic framework around which this government has enacted significant changes in Victoria to and for the use of, for those who need cannabis for therapeutic purposes. It was a commitment that Labor made on coming to government to establish a framework for the use of the legalisation of therapeutic use of medicinal cannabis in this state, the first jurisdiction in the country in 2016 to move towards access to medicinal cannabis. And that's a step that other jurisdictions have now followed. We passed those laws, we sought clear advice from the Law Reform Commission and set up a regulatory framework that thousands of Victorians are now using to access at a medicinal level the cannabis that they require to support medical conditions based on the advice and direction of a healthcare professional. I think what that demonstrates is that, again, the government, in considering issues associated with cannabis use, but also other drug use in the community, takes an approach that's founded in harm minimisation that focuses on therapeutic benefits, but does so in a way driven by the Parliament and in a thoughtful and considered way. I don't think that a plebiscite is the way to achieve further steps on drug law reform in this state.
Ms Puglielli.
President, very pleased to rise on behalf of my Greens colleagues and myself to speak on this motion before us today, noting, of course, that the Greens will be supporting it. As the motion itself says, a plebiscite on cannabis legalisation would ensure that every Victorian has a direct voice in shaping one of the most long overdue drug policy reforms of our time, and we can, for sure, as has been canvassed, have a discussion about the exact way in which we do that and that process at a more technical level. But at a principled level, this is a good idea. It's a good idea to me. I'm a huge fan of democracy, not in a selective basis, but continually. Democracy is a wonderful thing. And so this proposal to hold a plebiscite about the decriminalisation of personal cannabis use sounds like a great idea. And I think there's a lot of people, as we've heard today in this debate, out there who think this would be excellent. There's over 40% of people in this country who've tried cannabis at some point in their life. Even more, somewhere around 80% of people do not support the criminalisation of cannabis. We've heard it in this debate today. And yet people get elected saying they're representative of the broader community. They get into this place and they don't have the guts to even look at this stuff. Like that's the issue that we're confronted here. And so I think it is reasonable to find pathways to give people that direct input, to hold up a yardstick, to see just how we're going and representing community attitudes on this stuff. Like that's what this puts before us here today. The decriminalisation model, that the personal adult use of cannabis bill engages in is very similar to the one that's been in use up and running in the ACT for several years now. It's one of those things when you get more Greens elected and they get into shared government, these things become possible. When myself and members of the Legal and Social Issues Committee, colleagues from this place, undertook the inquiry process into this bill, we went up to Canberra, we saw just how things were operating up there, and what we saw, pleasingly, was that there had been no increase in road trauma, there'd been no increase in hospitalisation. In fact, we heard there'd been less young people using cannabis, which might seem counterintuitive. And given that this is a decriminalisation model, arrests were unsurprisingly significantly reduced. It means less people being needlessly dragged through the courts for minor possession and use. Victoria should be considering seriously engaging in this scheme. And so it was disappointing that despite all of that evidence, despite all of the processes, all of the reviews, all of the work that has gone into presenting to this government what people think about this issue, the evidence that exists around this issue and has for many years, that the Labor government has refused to support the majority of, say, the inquiry recommendations into this, and that they continue to keep their heads in the sand and act as if our current cannabis laws are fair and reasonable. And yet thousands of Victorians, as it says in the motion, continue to come into contact with the criminal justice system simply for the personal use of small amounts of cannabis. We should be changing our cannabis laws. With an election looming, it is time that parties in this state offered bold and positive and progressive reforms like these for Victoria. The Greens would like to see cannabis fully legalised and regulated, and that's what we will vote for in this place. So in saying that, every Greens MP elected into this place or the other place puts us another step closer to this important reform. With safe, legal and regulated access to cannabis, people will be able to responsibly enjoy a brownie or some homegrown bud in the same way they currently do a beer. And the revenue earned can be invested into health promotion. It can be invested into education. It can be invested into support services, all of which right now need more government funding. We should not be running people through the criminal justice system for possession or consumption of cannabis while organised crime continues to profit from a flourishing black market. It is time that our laws were updated, so bring on democracy. I commend this motion to the House.
Ms Payne, in reply.
Thank you, President. I just want to thank everyone for their contributions today and make a few statements in regard to some of the contributions that have been made. Particularly would like to acknowledge Ms Terpstra, Mr Mulholland, Mr Limbrick, Ms Watt, Ms Crozier, my colleague Mr Ettershank, Mr Batchelor and Mr Puglielli for making a contribution today. I think on the outset, just looking at Ms Terpstra's conversation around, as someone else who's also part of the SARC committee, as the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, we obviously took that advice from the amazing staff at the Parliamentary Council, and their expertise is always very much appreciated. And, I think listening to the experts in how to draft legislation is what we rely on in this place. But I wouldn't take note with the fact that if that was the most alarming thing in this SARC report, when we've literally had this government turn around to say that they are going to not allow prisoners 1 hour of access to fresh air, and the breach of the Charter of Human Rights that was acknowledged in that report, I think that then you've got your priorities around the wrong way. Mr Mulholland, not that he's here, but I don't want to give you a civics lesson. But I will acknowledge that you think that vicarious liability is a trendy issue. I think what's fascinating about being part of Legalise Cannabis is that we are a bit of a broad church of people who are our membership base, and many of our membership are victim survivors. And so some of the issues that we do present before Parliament may not be cannabis related, but are always in line with what our party principles are. Ms Watt highlighted the fact that medicinal cannabis was introduced a decade ago now and very much celebrated that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that cannabis as a therapeutic product is exactly why we're calling for it to be regulated, because that's why people access cannabis. Those that grow their own at home do so because they're using it therapeutically. I acknowledge Ms Crozier's contribution, and I also acknowledge that many of the other contributions today highlighted their time on committees, whether it be Ms Crozier and Fiona Patton working on that committee around the use of cannabis inquiry. I think that was in 2020, whereas we had the inquiry into the personal use of cannabis and looking at the ACT model in 23-24 from memory. What was evident throughout that process is that the expertise there is saying that we know more now, and I don't think we have ever identified cannabis as saying that it is harmless. We all acknowledge that there are harms and risks associated with cannabis. But what we do know is that the greatest harm is caused by the interactions with the criminal justice system, as my colleague Mr Ettershank pointed out. In saying that, I think that we've had a rigorous debate today, and I think it is important to also acknowledge that democratic process here is something that we should hold strong. People having their say on things that are fairly outdated laws, I think should be something that we should be normalising. The fact that we are at 100 years of prohibition next year of cannabis is something where we should be allowing there to be rigorous debate on that, whether that be in the public forum and influencing us in Parliament, or whether we continue to look at laws that may not be fit for purpose and how we might action that. In summary, I thank you all for your time today, and thank you, President.
Thank you. The question is notice of motion 1552 be agreed to. All those in say aye. Aye. Against no? No. The noes have it. Ring the bells for 4 minutes, please. Close the doors, please. Members, we're dividing over notice of motion 1552. Can I invite members who are voting for that motion to now stand in their place? Thank you. Members, you can return to your seats. Can I invite members who are voting against the motion to now stand in their place, and can I indicate I'm voting against the motion? Thank you, members. You can return to your seats. The result of the division is ayes 8, noes 27. Therefore, the motion has been defeated. I'll call Dr. Heath for the remaining general business.